Welcome to Season 2, Episode 6 of Tech Talk Thursdays. My guest today is Michael Ford. He is the Senior Director of Emerging Industry Strategy at Aegis Corporation. He's also widely acknowledged as the driving force behind the IPC CfX Standard and has more recently turned his attention towards the issue of counterfeit components and materials and how to develop a secure supply chain. That's the topic we're going to be discussing today, so let's join our guest, Michael Ford.
So welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining me today. We've had a lot of discussions over the years about counterfeit components. It's prolific in our industry in some respects. And I think our first discussions went back as far as we started in 2016, looking at some of the competing technologies around then, at that time, for dealing with this issue. Can you recall some of these?
Oh, yes, the good old days. It was amazing that when we sat down with everybody in 2016, that there wasn't actually any standard for traceability across the industry. Mm-hmm. There were companies who had papers that listed out what kind of things they wanted, but there was no single source of information. So as people were asking for traceability, they didn't really know what they wanted, what they needed, what it was all about, and they certainly didn't understand the cost of that data collection. And so suddenly we saw a huge burden coming into manufacturing for collecting data that may never actually be used. So, it was really nice to be able to create the 1782, the IPC standard, the very first one in the industry for traceability within the assembly operation.
Right. Okay. But then as that applies then to counterfeits, I mean, the counterfeit issue in itself is a multi-headed problem. They come in so many different guises. Run me through some of the different types of things you come across.
It's interesting that I would say the vast majority of counterfeits never see the light of day in terms of being reported to people, because it's a kind of like an embarrassment that a manufacturer or distributor or even a component maker would be associated with such devices. And so trying to keep their reputations clean, they tend not to look at it. But there are rules in the US, certainly, for the military side that they have to report these things. And so we kind of turn toward these operations as a source of information. For example, the US Government Accountability Office stated that 40% of the Department of Defense supply chain is suffering an adverse impact from fake or defective parts.
Wow.
So we have to be careful how we interpret that, because it's being very carefully worded. But it certainly gives the impression that a large quantity, if you like, of end products have had failures associated with counterfeit materials. And I think the NAVSEA Warfare Control, they reported that of the failures that they have seen in the market, 5% of them have been caused through counterfeit components directly. And even go on.
Yeah, no, just to break that down a bit. I mean, you're not saying, you're saying 40% of the failures had been traced back to counterfeit components.
That's what the report was saying. And, we always need to look into the detail of such things to understand, are those critical things that have been changed? And we do hear about critical things like programmable PGAs, for example, that, have been counterfeit and been a large target for counterfeit. Mm-hmm. But more recently, I mean, certainly in these COVID times, we see that the problem is changing a little bit, because I think it was in 2018, we saw a shortage in the market of ceramic condensers. And so these were put onto allocation. So manufacturers couldn't get all of them that they needed. And we suddenly saw information that this became the most counterfeit component of all. Suddenly there were millions of counterfeits of these components in the market. And, not all of the counterfeits are completely duff parts. Some of them work similar to the real part. It may just be that, in this case, the dielectric was made from an inferior material. So it worked often, but would fail. There would be reliability issues. And so it's even the passive components that we now see a problem.
Yeah, I mean, even some of these components, they're using genuine components, but old ones that have been reclaimed and just resurfaced and rebadged, as it were. But of course, they've obviously had some wear.
One of the original stories was, a case that we saw, a reel of 1,000 components. The first 100 were genuine, and then every seventh one was counterfeit. So it's specifically targeted to defeat incoming inspection. And when the problem happens, when these are detected, there's so much noise in the system, nobody knows where the counterfeits came from. Very clever guy.
Yeah, it is, but it's a real issue, especially when you're working in high reliability applications, like automotive or aircraft or stuff like that. You want to make sure the components you're using are genuine.
Well, there was
do you recall? Yeah, do you recall going back to our earlier meetings on this, the stunning statement by the Department of Defense that up to 15% of their incoming goods was regarded as counterfeit.
Yes, I remember that.
I was fairly shocked by it. I mean, if the military can't having 15% counterfeit, then what are the rest of us getting?
Exactly. And, they make huge amount of efforts. They spend 5 times as much money on procuring their material simply because they know there is this potential for counterfeit. And yet they still have this problem. So we see manufacturers, just an ordinary manufacturer in Europe, seeing counterfeits 2 to 3 times a year. So, it's just going on all the time. And the real scale of the problem is still difficult to understand. But we can imagine. And that's part of the problem too, because it comes down to risk. If you're going to make a product which needs to be safety critical, like a car or an aeroplane, you read the stories, you see the figures, and then you have to associate those to a risk. And then you have to plan, well, how much money are we going to spend trying to inspect these, trying to, eliminate this threat of counterfeit from our production. And then you see price rises because the costs are going up.
Yeah.
So it's a negative spiral currently, and that's what we need to turn around.
So bring us up to speed then, and some of the initiatives and technologies that are coming through. Which ones seem to be looking like they might be have some legs, have some potential to address this problem?
We saw, from the 2016 traceability standard, we are able to map, for example, if you have a laptop in front of you, any particular device within that laptop, we can trace back to the incoming package of the manufacturer. And then we're dependent on their ERP records as to where that component came in. So that's the limit of the traceability to date. What we've been working on for the last year or so with IPC again is to update the 1782 standard to include logistics in the supply chain. Because you've got several different clusters of industry involved in making a product. A cluster manufacturing components, a cluster doing the assembly, and then a cluster actually using the product. But between those clusters, you are linking these entities together. The components will leave a trusted environment to go to the assembler, who is a trusted environment. How do you know that they have not been intercepted on that journey? And so we've created a set of rules associated with the association of an immutable ID on packaging, together with tamper-evident packaging, together with data being stored on a blockchain, which again is tamper-evident. So you're tying a physical immutable identifier to an immutable data record so that you can be absolutely assured of exactly the path of that material. And more importantly, if something happens to that package, you know about it immediately, and you know the source of the responsibility for that event. You may not know who it was that came in and replaced the chips or whatever, but you will know who was the responsible entity at that point. And with responsibility comes a renewed objective to ensure that counterfeits never have that ingress point. So we are looking forward to a much more secure supply chain. But the critical thing is that even though this idea is not new, and we see a lot of other companies doing this, it has to be interoperable, because you can't just have a condition where one company gets their materials from one supplier and it's covered with a secure supply chain. We need some form of standard to make this interoperable. And so that is the addition to the standard that's coming out within the end of this year.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, or a big lack of visibility as to the origins of a lot of these devices. When you talk to manufacturers, they don't know where half of them actually originate from. Did they come from China? Did they come from Vietnam? Did they come from some other place? In fact, there's been a rise during COVID again of these online RFQ systems, which have more visibility to track the origins of these things and assess the risk, so that if there was, a major geopolitical event or whatever, you can second source and look for different places to source your supply. But as I say, it needs to really get down to the device level, I think, being able to track these things. So the packaging is great, but is it going to be possible to get something down to the device level?
Well, this is the next challenge, actually, because, you think about this passage of packages between one trusted environment and the next, and each trusted environment has traceability. But the problem is that each trusted environment has different traceability. The traceability you get from IPC within the assembly shop floor is not the same as you get from semi in the semiconductor world. So if and when something happens, the ability to do the tracing back, the provenance of the material, is quite difficult, actually. So in this case, we're looking at the next challenge as being, how can we have a unique component authentication so that you could go, for example, to the driverless car that you just bought. You can turn on that car, and that car will do a self-check. It will look electronically at the chips that it has on each of the circuit boards in each of its controllers, and will, through the internet, confirm that those chips are authentic. And so throughout the manufacturing process of the component, where an ID is established, and throughout assembly, where IDs are associated together, like the chips onto a circuit board and the circuit board into the controller and the controller into the car, that you can have this immutable ID. Some semiconductors now, there is the technology where at the first instance of powering up that wafer, you just put a couple of probes onto the wafer itself. It powers up the chip for the first time, and that triggers a write once memory write, which is generating a unique identifier and writing that identifier into the chip. There is nothing you can do to that chip to change that ID. And that ID at that point is registered on a blockchain for this authentication. And so wherever that chip appears, we can then know that it's authentic. And of course, it can report information about itself and about its surrounding circuitry. And if you then turn on your car and that chip's not there, then you know that somebody has come in and they've altered something. So it really is a mechanism to establish that point of trust as early as possible within the component manufacturing cycle and be able to follow that all the way through.
Try first. Don't just say, I can't. Try and find a way to do it.
We will exceed your expectations.
Nice to meet you. We are Omron.
I don't think it's likely somebody's going to come in and fiddle with your car and change out the boards, unless, of course, maybe it goes in for maintenance or something like that, and they use an inferior product. I guess in that circumstance, it could certainly be true. But no, it's certainly a very interesting theory. So it would trace that unique identifier with the component all the way through its life cycle.
Yeah, that's it. And this goes a little bit beyond the semiconductor arena as well, because there are technologies now that can uniquely recognize devices just from their surface. It's an amazing technology, actually. You simply use a normal camera and you look at the surface of something, and it's not a label. It's not something that's been attached, because anything that's attached can be attached by somebody else. What man makes, another man can make as well. Forget it. It's got to be an intrinsic feature of the material itself. And so there are a couple of different companies that have this technology, so that you can literally just take a picture of each component as it goes down the line, and you assign a unique identifier to that, which then can be checked at the point of use. So, it becomes this immutable, unique identifier for these key components.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, we do need to have this sort of level of identity and traceability at the device level. But I mean, as I think I was speaking to you a couple of weeks ago, or last week, was it? And I mentioned that, today you go into a factory and you pick up a reel of components and it's got something like 6 or 8 different barcodes stuck to it.
Oh, yes.
Why can we not just have one that travels with the reel right from inception right through to final assembly?
Yeah,
that would help.
it.
Yeah, I mean, that would help to harmonize the supply chain and improve the traceability, I would think, because every time you have to put the details for or scan the details for a new barcode, you have the potential for things to go wrong.
Indeed. And there are entities now, companies who are providing unique identifiers for all things. And they're all kind of secured. So there are many, many different technologies for that. But we are looking at that as well. Because, we talk about this. We talk about traceability and secure supply chain and immutable IDs. And people are just rolling up the dollar signs. They're thinking, this sounds really, really expensive, futuristic technology. It's not going to apply to me. But actually, the opposite is true. The incremental cost of this stuff, most of it's all in the digital realm. And it doesn't actually cost that much more. However, you look at the cost associated with counterfeit events, the amount of rework, the amount of misdeliveries, the potential liabilities for when things go wrong. And you begin to realize that, if this technology can truly eliminate the threat of counterfeit, then we're saving a massive amount of money in the industry. And all it takes is, as you said, put one ID on there. Let's all know it and trust it and not have to reinvent wheel after wheel after wheel, and just all agree that this is the way we're going to do things. And we do things in such a way as things can be trusted, which is the set of rules that we're developing with these 3 levels of solution. Right.
But I mean, the only way that you can really implement such a thing is really through a trade association and a standard, so that the industry then gets around that standard, and the OEMs start to say, well, you have to make my assemblies in accordance with this standard, so that they get around it. So is there a possibility that SEMI and IPC are going to work together on this?
We have found that both organizations have common aims, and we're both sitting in different clusters. We understand that cluster needs to be bridged. So there are discussions going on in both, at the levels within the organization, as well as the volunteers who volunteer in each of these different domains. Because we do have the industry's need at heart. Ultimately, we're going to have to find a solution for this. And, I think that the nice thing about electronics and semiconductor is that we are the most difficult sector within the industry. What happens in electronics, if it can work in electronics with all the millions and billions of components that we have, it can work throughout the whole of assembly manufacturing, and even, other areas of manufacturing too. So we should be the ones who are working together to establish what needs to be done for industry for the future. Trusted industry, trusted manufacturing, local component sourcing, and a complete trust in all of that. at a
Absolutely.
cost, which is
I'm all for the associations, creating the guiding principles rather than the politicians.
yes, indeed. The standards approach is really important, because otherwise you would end up with one or two companies having a monopoly on this kind of thing, and those things never work. De facto standards or particular things, it takes a long time to become established, and even then you're wondering how secure things are. The true interoperability comes from standards organizations. So we're really looking for working together on this.
Yeah, excellent. Well, give us just to round up, give us a timeline. When do you think we will have a situation where we will have a really secure supply chain?
There are two ways it can go. And one of the silver linings from COVID is that people are really looking at this, because materials are short and there is this increased potential for counterfeit. I personally do not want to get to the situation where we have an event that means that we have to do this, like some world-changing event, an aeroplane falling from the sky, or whatever it might be, some catastrophic event that will be traced back to a counterfeit material, and that is going to change the industry. When that would happen, it could be next week, it could be in 10 years from now, it could be in 100 years from now. I don't want that timeline. The timeline I prefer to see is over the next 6 months, we start talking about this seriously. Within the next year or so, we have a interoperable standard that bridges these clusters. And within 2 to 3 years, we have major take-up of this by the component manufacturers, by the distributors, and then all the way through assembly. It's not unrealistic if we start to work together. The big if is, are we going to work together? And who is going to be the one who steps forward and says, look, I'm putting my hand up, I understand counterfeits exist, I know it's not my fault, but I want to do something about it. And for the people who step up and start to join this kind of activity, that is it's a much bigger acceleration than we would normally have. So the 3-year, 4-year timeline would seem to work. But we could be talking in 10 years' time, if I'm still around, to say, where did it all go wrong? But it would only go wrong if we don't work together. We
have to work together, but we are also very resistant to change, and typically in our industry, the EMS companies don't make change unless their customers insist to make change. So really, it has to come from that direction as well.
Indeed. And we are seeing, people very much more aware of environment, very much more aware of risk now. So, it is beginning to build that momentum.
Yeah, great topic. I think we're certainly going to be talking about it for a while, Michael. I hope it's not going to be more than 4 or 5 years. But thank you for joining me today and giving us an update. And we'll keep a keen eye on the development of the counterfeit component development.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Well, that's it for this week's edition of Tech Talk Thursday. Michael Ford's going to be joining me again, actually, next week on Tuesday for our panel discussion on automating the materials flow within the factory. Until then, look after yourself, stay safe, and have a great weekend.
Global SMT and Packaging opens the windows of the world to bring you the latest news and technologies from Munich, from Bangalore, from Shanghai, from San Diego.